So everybody should have the link to these slides, yeah? Because you all did the prep work on slides 6 and 7, right? Fantastic. Okay, so why automated testing? What's RSpec? Installing RSpec Rails, which you already did, right? Running RSpec, scaffolding with RSpec, testing models and controllers, and understanding errors. So when we talk about unit tests, the biggest benefit is that we prevent regressions. So regressions, again, are when the code was working and then you make a change and the code no longer works. That's a regression. And regressions are particularly bad if you introduce a regression in something you release to a customer or a client. So the customer's using the software, it works, you make a change that's supposed to improve the product and that thing breaks. And then customers and clients are never impressed with that. You know, it just really is not a good look to do that. So as developers, we really, really hate regressions, and we really try to avoid them. Automated testing encourages writing good code. It also speeds up development. So this is, you know, something that developers will really push back on. We don't have time to write tests. Writing tests is writing code. You've just given us twice as much code to write. Okay, true, it takes more time to write tests, but it saves a lot more time in debugging. So if you don't test your code and you don't have testable code, when a problem does come up, a lot of times you'll find that you have to look through the whole damn code stack to figure out what happened. And that can take you hours or days or sometimes weeks. On the other hand, if you have automated tests and you have good test coverage, then you'll be able to isolate, okay, it's not here, there's no problem here, there's no problem here, it's in this small sliver here, this is where we have to look for the problem. It really speeds it up, really speeds it up. So it absolutely saves time. And I'm going to say it will be required in every development job you take. I have taken jobs where I didn't have to write any tests, and those were not good jobs. Okay? So any job, I'll qualify this by saying any job that you want will have this requirement. All right?
It does sound like a culture thing.
It is.
Yeah.
It is for sure. And I would advise you that when you're interviewing for jobs that you ask them about their testing and what part of the development process is focused on testing. So is testing, you know, writing tests a required part of submitting code? And how much test coverage is there for this, you know, for the product? I would ask those questions, because if they're like, you know, we don't really, you know, we'd like to, but we don't really do it, then I wouldn't be super keen to go work there because it really does create this terribly stressful environment, and it's not nice. All right, so RSpec. RSpec is just a gem, and it's a framework of code with testing classes that we can use. And the RSpec Rails gem is specifically for Rails, go figure. And it helps you test your Rails app development environment before you take it into production. And it has RSpec as a dependency, no surprise there. So when you use Rails scaffold to generate a controller model, if you have RSpec Rails installed and enabled, it will automatically generate the test files that you need to test the thing that you scaffold. So I'll show you that. We'll demonstrate it. There are other testing frameworks, so many testing frameworks, okay? So I'm going to show you RSpec today, but know that there are lots of other testing frameworks, and they're appropriate for different things. The one that actually comes with Rails by default, because you noticed I had to ask you to install something for us to be able to use RSpec. So by default, Rails uses Minitest. And so you'll see when you generate a Rails app, you've got this test subdirectory, and it's got some testing files in it. And if you run Rails test, it'll run those specs, okay? Some people like Minitest, but most people prefer RSpec over Minitest. Okay, it's just, it's a bit easier to use, I find, too. It's a bit more readable, the test results. There's a bit more flexibility. There's some nice arguments. So they are similar. They do sort of the same thing. and you could use either, and understanding how to use either would be beneficial. Okay. Cucumber is more at the sort of executive level, so it focuses on readability for business purposes. So it's, you use Cucumber and you generate results that like your VP can understand. Capybara is used for end-to-end testing, so it simulates button clicks and filling in form fields and that things happen. So what you would typically do is you would use RSpec or Minitest to do unit testing and use something like Capybara to do end-to-end testing. You would use both of them. Okay. All right, so everybody's done this. This is all good. And fantastic. And everybody's done this. All right. Okay, so let's try this. You can try along with me. So you can either run, I'll just talk about this for a second, you can run bundle exec RSpec or you can just run RSpec. And the difference is that if you've got a different version of RSpec specified in your gem file than you have installed globally in your system, bundle install RSpec is going to use the one that's specified in your gem file. For you guys it should be the same one, so you can just run RSpec. Okay, so that's the difference between doing the two. So from here, and I've also got this forked on my machine here, and we can run it and make sure that it runs. I think that I've got one more item in my database that I added when I was testing. You can have a play around with this if you want to. So just to see how it works, it's a really simple app. So if we do ask question, you can put in an email address, and then you can put in a question. This is my question. And then you can submit it, and it adds the question to the top of the list. It grabs a gravatar. If it can't find a gravatar for that email address, it generates a robot gravatar, and you can see that it's listing things by the date that they were the most recent added, and then I can click on View Answers, and if there are any answers, and those would display on this show page, I can submit a new answer. And then when I submit that, it just leaves me on the same page, and it updates and shows me the answer there. Okay. So that's how it works. And I can go back to the home page, and it's not a super complicated app. Yes?
Are the robots equals, or are they gravitars?
No, they're gravatars.
I've always seen you get the on button symbol. I've never seen the robots before.
Yeah, it's an argument that I passed. Yeah, cool. To get the robots.
Yeah, I didn't know they gave you a random spit out. I thought they just gave you the G.
There are other choices too. You don't have to use robots. There are other things. So you can have a look and see what they've got there. So I'm gonna kill it for the moment. And if we just run RSpec, then it's like you don't have any tests. And if we look at the code, Inception, if we look at the code, you'll see there's this test directory. So this is what comes with Rails, and these are tests, but they're mini tests. Okay, and we're just going to kind of ignore those for this session. But if we ran Rails tests, then it would run these tests. Okay, of which there's not anything in them. So it just kind of gives you skeletons, and then you've got to write the test yourself. But what RSpec looks for is a spec directory. And there's no spec directory here, and that's why it says I can't find any tests. Okay? So that's not incredibly exciting. So there's nothing there. Okay, so after you install RSpec, like we did on slide 7, so you install it with gem install, and then you do that Rails generate RSpec install. Then once you've done that, any scaffolding you do after you've done that will generate the spec files for the thing that you scaffold. and that will be there for testing with RSpec. And so if we hadn't already scaffolded the question model, for example, then if we ran this command, then it would generate the spec directory and the files that we need for testing everything related to question. But since we've already done that and we don't want to overwrite what we've already got there, if you run scaffold with the -- skip option, what that does is it says if it already exists, just skip that and create anything new that needs to be created. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. So now we're going to run Rails G scaffold question with -- skip. And that did not. Oh, because you have to say what you want to scaffold. Okay, so if we look at the output here, then what you'll see is that it skips the stuff that there are already files for, and then it generates some things. So it generated a resources route. Well, I didn't really need that because I'd handled it a different way, but that's okay. And it created some view files. Okay, well, I didn't really need that either. Those weren't part of my solution. We'll live with that. We can go delete those if we want to. But the other things that it generated was, did it generate any spec? Oh, you know what? Maybe I haven't done what I asked you to do in this particular version. Oh, that's not what I meant. Okay, now I have to look back because I can't remember what it is. Rails G RSpec install. Isn't that what I just did? That's what I just did. Am I in the right directory? I'm in the right directory.
You go to G10
Let's make sure. So I had done this, and then I did work, and I was like, no, I'm going to start over from scratch. So let's just have a look. Nope, I don't. It was just like that, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay, or you can write it the right way. RSpec Rails. I had a 50-50 chance. Okay. So when you guys did it, when you did the scaffold, did it create some test files for you?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. All right. There we go. RSpec. That's what we're looking for. It invoked RSpec and it created that. Okay, cool. Okay, so now if we try to run RSpec again after we've generated those RSpec files. Ugh. And then you're like, why would I do that? That's terrible. What have I just done? So, too much. That's a lot of output. It's hard to understand it if you start to look through it. There's a lot there. So we can do some things. And I think actually, so RSpec-FD, it might actually do that by default. When I created this 6 months ago, I don't think it did, but it might. So I'll have a look at that in a minute, but first let's try to just run some specific tests so we don't see everything. So what we can do is we can specify to RSpec a specific file that we want to run. So let's just run the test for the question model. Let's do that. So you'll see that the file is under spec. Under spec we have subdirectories just like we do under app. So we have controllers, helpers, models, request, routing, views. And if you look under models, there's one for the question model. Okay? So we can just run that file in particular. So if we run RSpec, spec models question spec.rb. Now I'm just going to run it with -fd to see if the output's any different. No, I think it's the same. So I think when I did this the first time, it wasn't. Okay, so if we run just that one, then ignoring the Selenium driver deprecation, there's some failures listed here expected and do not affect your suite's status. So it says add some examples to or delete this particular file, not yet implemented. Okay, so that's pretty clear. And if you look at the file, we saw that it has a pending statement. So by default, it's going to populate with these pending statements, and it will, print something out like what we just saw that said, you need to do something here if you want to use this to test. Okay? All right, so let's look at the structure of an RSpec test file. So you'll see that it requires Rails helper, and that's one of the things that got installed when we did that Rails G RSpec install. And then it'll have a describe line. And you can just pass a string to describe, like should blah, blah, blah. Or you can give it arguments like this. So you can give it a class name, the class that you're testing with this test, and you can give it a type, so the type of class that this thing is. And so in this case, we're testing a model. And after the describe, we have a do, and it has an end, so it's like a block of code in this describe. Then inside of a describe block, we put it blocks, and so an it is like a single test. And so we say it, and then we give it a string which describes what this thing is testing, and it also has a do and an end. So we have an it blocks inside of describe blocks. So we'll add a model test. So when we think about testing a model, we want to make sure, for example, that it creates questions with the correct fields. So we can call question creates in our test. We can give it the inputs that we would expect to create, and then we can make sure that it creates a question object with the information that we passed in. Now, one thing to know is when we run RSpec, it's going to use like a brand new copy of the database, like a separate copy of the database. So even though we already have data in our database, because we can see it when you run the app. So I seeded the database with just a few examples, right? When you run RSpec, it's not using your development database. It's using a separate database, and it actually, the behavior of RSpec is that it's going to clear it when you run the test, okay? So you'll run the test, and it will populate the database, it checks the data, and then it deletes what's there. So if you run the test again, that's why I can refer to question.first. See, I'm referring to question.first. So what does question.first do?
It'll bring up the first question.
It'll, take the very first record in that table, right, in that database table question. And so in order for this to work, of course, it must clear it. It must clear it every time, right?
Does it clear after every test or clear at the end of all of the tests?
It clears after every test unless you use some hooks, which I might get to. We'll see if we get there. Okay, so if you can copy and paste this if you want, or you can type it in. You can type it in if you want. You can see that it uses expect assertion. So there's a link in the slides about that. If you've been doing the morning challenges, the recent ones, I've been using RSpec. Have you noticed that? So you'll have gotten a little bit familiar with the syntax anyway, right? So the RSpec uses the expect library to do assertions. So I'm just going to grab this bit and replace what's here. Yeah, thanks. Like that doesn't look right. Here, yeah, thanks. I'll fix that in the slide too. So, right here, it's missing an apostrophe. Right there. So add that in. So we call question create with the 2 arguments, the email and the body. And then we're testing expect question.first.email to equal the one that we just created it with, and question.first.body to equal the body that we just passed in. So if we save that and we run the same test again, then yay, it passes. So did everybody get that result?
Yep.
All good? Anybody stuck there? Yeah, so I took the guts out of the describe. So you should have 2 ends. Do you have an error?
Yeah, no, it's just when you copy and paste with the new
Ah,
apostrophe, it doesn't like it, so we just change it to the number 1.
right.
I don't know how to explain that.
Yeah, so it's that like the it's like the PowerPoint. Yes.
It just doesn't
Yes.
format it.
Yes. Yes. I see what you mean. Yeah, I think when I did this originally, maybe I copied it from here and pasted it in, and I don't know, maybe I deleted that one. Let's see if I do this. Bloody PowerPoint.
So if we're only going to use RSpec, but we've still got that test folder in this example database, are we okay to just delete that test folder?
You can, yeah, yeah, for sure.
So that's not going to break anything.
No, it's not going to break anything.
We just have to run RSpec, otherwise it won't do any tests.
That's right. And even if you have the test folder there, if you're not running Rails tests, it's not testing anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
All right, is everybody okay now? For on? Did you get there? Yeah, cool. All right.
I go ahead.
Yeah, I got an issue.
Okay, what'd you get?
The spec folder hasn't gotten anything yet.
The spec folder. Okay, did you run, you ran Rails G scaffold question -- skip? So this one? Rails G scaffold question -- skip. Because the first time I did it, I forgot to put question in it, and it didn't actually do anything. Is there a spec folder at all?
Yeah, there's a spec folder now.
Yeah. Do you have files there now?
No.
No files. Okay, do this. Remove your spec folder.
Yep.
Now run Rails G scaffold question -- skip again.
There it is.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you go to the spec models question and paste in that stuff, then.
Thank you.
Okay. So this is just about, if you run Rails test, it's going to use the stuff in the test directory, and that's going to use mini test. And just a word of caution about that is that test uses test data populated by YAML files in the fixture subdirectory. So if you've ever run Rails test, your test database is populated with that data. So let me show you what that looks like, because in the fixtures folder, you'll have like this, and it just creates, and it'll populate your test database with that data if you run Rails test. And the way that mini-test works is it leaves that test data, well, it just repopulates it with fixtures every time you run it. So if you are going to use mini-test and you're going to use Rails test, just make sure that this fixtures data is populated with data that makes sense to you, that you're going to use in testing, or get rid of it if you don't want any test data in there when you start. Okay? So just a word of caution about that if you decide to use that. And you can clear your test database by running db:/test:/prepare with Rails or Rake. If you've already run test and you want to get rid of that data that populated the database. All right, so we got our first passing test. So as a minimum on your assessment, because this is really easy to do, I would expect that you test that your models can be created when you give them the correct parameters. Now, it's not a super useful test, honestly, because you generally don't have problems with models. You don't even really write most of that code. Like, Rails writes it for you. It's generally not a problem, okay? It's more important to test your controllers, but this is like a low-hanging fruit to get some test coverage and to practice the syntax and to practice understanding the results and things like that, okay? So just take it. But it does help to ensure that if you make schema changes, that you have made those schema changes thoughtfully. All right? So if you have a test, for example, like the one we just wrote, where we're saying, you know, I expect my question to have an email and a body, right? Now, that's pretty trivial, right? But say you had a more complex object and you had these fields, and then you decide to change it mid-project. It happens, and you're like, actually, instead, I'm going to represent the data this way. I'm going to take away this field and add this other field. If you had a test that was testing for the existence of that field, then that test is going to error when you run it after you make that change. And what's good about that is it just has you being really conscious about the changes you're making, and everybody's going to know that you made that change. So if you have a practice on your team that we run the test before we submit, push code up to GitHub, then somebody who maybe wasn't aware that somebody else made that change to the model is suddenly going to become aware. Oh, what happened to the model? This test is failing. Oh, what happened to that field? It's not there anymore. Okay? So if nothing else, it's a way of kind of enforcing this intentionality and communication between team members. Okay? So it's good for that reason. Otherwise, it's not incredibly useful, but it's good for that reason, testing models. So controller tests, though, are much more interesting and I think more important. So let's have a look at the controller test. So if we have a look, and you'll see this when we look at the controller test. So that model test, the default was pretty straightforward, right? There's not much in there. But if you have a look under spec, under controllers, at the questions controllers test, there's a lot going on in here. There's a lot happening. So what you'll see is that there's, first of all, there are these two let statements that talk about attributes. We'll get back to that in a minute. And talk about a valid session. And then there's test basically for get and post, update and delete for all of the routes that we have defined related to this object. Okay? And it actually has some tests here for you that test basic functionality. That when we call get on index, we get a success response. That when we call show, we get a success response. We can create a question and then we get a success response. When we call new, so it's really basic. It's basically just testing that we can navigate to these routes and it works. Okay? So, but there's a lot in here, so let's have a closer look. First, we'll have a look at the get methods. Okay, so we'll start there. So this is the get methods that we see. So we have get for index, show, new, and edit. And this is all related to our question object. So let's try running just the controller spec with RSpec and see what happens. What was it called? Questions controller spec. Okay, so when we run it, we don't get any failures, but we have 11 pendings. There's actually one that passes, new passes. We get a success response, but everything else is pending. So it's not incredibly interesting. So let's focus on the get results for now. Now let me show you one thing that we can do with RSpec is we can pass this E flag, and what that E flag will do basically is a grep, and it does a grep in the description text. And so I can grep for get, for example, and it'll only show me stuff related to the questions on get, and that's based on the way we describe the test. So you can see how it's really important to have those descriptions in your it clauses, be useful so that you can do things like this. So if we look at the get ones, we can see that that there are the 4 of them. It's just a little bit nicer to look at less input. Okay. So we can see that it tells us for these pending ones that we need to add a hash of attributes valid for our model. And so it's pending until we do that. If we have a look at the test, we can see when we look at the get test, it calls valid attributes. Can you see that? All of these tests call valid attributes. Some of them call valid session. And in valid attributes, we have a skip right now. Okay? And so that's what triggers it to be a pending test, is we try to call something that's skipped and it says, okay, you need to do something about this before we can run this test. So we're going to have to add valid attributes. Does that make sense to everybody why we get that message? Did I explain that well enough? So we call this method valid attributes. It has a skip in it, and that results in us seeing output that says it's pending. Add a hash of attributes valid for your model. Okay. All right, so defining valid attributes isn't hard. We just put a hash in there of valid attributes. And it doesn't really matter what's there, it's the formatting of it. So we basically want to put something in here that is going to be used in these tests to create question objects, and we want the objects that we create to be valid objects. So we're just putting in like some test data here. And so we're just going to create an email and a body with text that we would expect to see in an email and a body, and we're going to put that in valid attributes. So let's do that. So we're going to replace the skip line with a hash with email. It doesn't matter what you put here. And a body. And we'll save that. And now that we have valid attributes, when we call question create, it's going to create the question with those attributes, and then it's going to run get and see if we get a success response. So after making that change, if we run the test again with the same line, okay. So 3 of them are okay, and 1 of them isn't. So now we have to figure out what's wrong with this one that failed. Does everybody get the same result when they run it?
Yeah, mine will pass as well.
You're all passed.
Yeah, we're just that good, eh?
I'm next level coded.
That's interesting that yours passes. Does have a look at your
Do we have the same stuff? I
should
just copied and pasted what was on the slide.
yeah. Yeah, should. Then it's not related to this, so it's not related to that. So notice that we do a get on index param session valid session, and we expect response to be successful. But the normal sort of Rails paradigm is that when you do a get on an object, it goes to like an index page for that object. But what we actually do here is we just reroute to home. And so it's failing for me because in this implementation we redirect to home and we don't actually have anything. I wonder if it generated it. If you look under your RSpec. If you look under app views, actually would be in routes, I think. You have the same thing. Does anybody else have that pass? Or does anybody else have it fail like mine does?
Mine fails.
It fails? So mine fails like this.
I'm getting mine fails.
Can I see your command again? Maybe I didn't put get in at the end.
That's just how it's done. 1253? Yeah.
Okay, because I'm using the one that's in the PowerPoint.
So are you seeing, when you use the one in the PowerPoint,
I'm just testing the questions controller spec being
yes,
format documentation.
yes.
Oh, no.
If you add a dash E, get to yours, because you'd just be seeing more output than what I'm seeing.
No, still pass. There's still pass.
All right. I don't know why yours passes. I'm going to have to look at what the difference is
It's
in the...
honest to God, it's just I've done the exact same stuff.
Yeah.
Alright, zero examples.
Where does next level?
I can pass any
Okay, so this will be, this next part will be interesting. Do this next part and let's see if it makes it fail, because I'm wondering if it's... We'll look back at that in a minute. Okay, so when somebody wants to view all the questions, question index, which is what that get tries to go to, is question index. It's the same as what we show on our home index, so we redirect there. Okay, so in my app I didn't implement question index, so I'm not sure why it's working for you. So the way that I fix this test is I use the redirect to expectation to test that the question index redirects to root path, because that's how it's implemented. So I'm interested to see if you make this change, if it breaks for you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, the expected was for example, one value?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Okay. Right. So the way that we're going to get this, the way we're going to get this to pass is to copy this redirects to root path. So again, if you look at the test, then it does a get on index. So it would try to go to questions hash index. That's where it tries to go to. We can have a look at routes to see if your routes look different than my routes. And I would expect this to fail because I shouldn't have a route for that. Does it fail for you now?
If I get rid of the...
If you replace it with what's in the slide,
Yeah.
so that it checks that it redirects to root path.
Yeah, I failed either redirect or root path.
Expected response to be a 3xx redirect, but was a 200 OK.
Yeah. Right. Okay, first let me just make sure that that hasn't passed for me. It does. So if you say, Rails routes, do you have a questions index show up in there? So there's a question index here,
Yeah.
but
Probably wrong. Must be that window panel.
It must be Ruby 2.6 on Twitter.
that is a difference, but I'd be surprised though. So what does your questions controller say in index?
What's the questions controller?
Yeah.
Is it in the roots or
In app. App controllers. Questions controller?
I've got more than you.
What? Did when you ran that generate scaffold,
Yeah.
did you do -- skip?
I did number 10 because I thought we were supposed to copy it. I thought we were supposed to do starting from a new scaffold. I thought we were supposed to do that.
No, that's why.
Right.
That's why.
I just would have done
So.
Yeah. That's why.
Okay. Sweet.
Yeah.
that. Dude, we're just putting in that groundwork.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That's
I
why
thought-
it's
I thought I
different.
was supposed to do that.
No, that's okay. That's why it's different though. So if you change your index to look like my index, so it redirects to root path instead of what it does by default.
Yeah. So I have to like.
Okay,
I'm
do you want to
just
just
gonna reclone,
reclaim? Yeah. Or if you do a git from the root directory, do a git checkout space dot. It'll undo everything you've done.
Git checkout dot.
Uh-huh.
How can I confirm that worked?
Do you have a spec directory still?
Are you still in your question controller thing?
Yes.
Okay.
You do? Are you in the root directory of your repo?
Yes. Git checkout full stop.
Yeah, with a space between checkout and full stop.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Should we do a git status?
I have about maybe 8 untracked files.
Okay. Yep. Yep. You could do a git reset head till d1. I don't know that that's going to matter though. But try.
I'll just stop.
Okay.
I'll catch up.
All right. Okay, so what had happened there, everybody, is that the way that I implemented this, the index in the questions controller just redirects to root path. That's what it does. But by default, Rails expects that your index goes to a page for questions. And so if we change our test to reflect what we're actually doing in our controller, which is the test that it redirects to root path, then it passes. Okay? All right, so all of those pass. Now let's move on to post, which is a little bit more interesting. So everybody knows what post methods do?
Adds to the database.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So we create things in the database with the post method. And if you look at the test, you'll see that we test post in 2 contexts, with valid attributes and with invalid attributes. And within each of those contexts, we'll have multiple tests. So if we first have a quick look at those tests, so RSpec, questions controller, and we go down to the post ones. So you'll see that there's a describe for create, and then there's a context for with valid params, and then there's a context for with invalid params. You see that? And then below that is, well, actually inside of that, with valid params, you'll see that there's two different tests. There's one that we can create a new question so that that create is successful, and then there's one that it redirects to the created question. So we're testing that both the question gets created and that the redirect happens the way that we expect it to. And again, the way these tests are written are based on the way that Rails works by default. And so if you do something different, like what I did with the questions index page where I redirect to root path, then you may have to change the test here. So if we try to run these tests by just passing a -e with post instead of get, then we'll see that there are some problems. So creates a new question is okay. That happens. But redirects to the created question with invalid params also is pending. But redirects to the created question fails for us with valid params, and then we can see we have a pending message for invalid params. So why do we have a pending message, do you think, for invalid params?
We haven't specified what invalid params is.
Exactly. Exactly. So just like we saw with the valid params, in the invalid params one, we call create with invalid params in this case, and when we call create with invalid params or with invalid attributes, then there's nothing there. So let's define invalid attributes. So to define invalid attributes, we can just define a hash with no email and no body. So we'll put the tags there, but we won't put any text there. Oh, we'll put blank strings. Okay, let's put blank strings. Just so it fails the same way that it's going to show on the slide, so you're not confused later. Okay, so now I've provided some invalid attributes, and I'll save that. And let's try running it again. And that didn't make anything better. Now we just have more failures. So let's figure out what's going on there. Okay. So now we have two failures. So it's important to be able to look at the failures and figure out why they're failing. Because sometimes it's because there's a problem in our code, and sometimes it's a problem with the test. Or it's just that the test expectation doesn't match the way our code's implemented. And that's intentional, but we just have to change the test. So right now, when we create a question, do you remember what happens when we create a question with the app the way it is right now? Okay, let's have a look at that. So I'm just going to run it. So right now, if I create a new question, what does it do?
Redirects the root path.
Yep, and I actually got it in there twice. Do you see that? Because I clicked it twice before it refreshed. That's interesting. That's something to know. Yeah, it shouldn't. It shouldn't. It redirects to the root path, though, right? And that's not the typical behavior. So the typical behavior when you create an object is it redirects to the show page for that object, but that's not what I'm doing in my implementation. So that's the cause of one of the failures we see there. All right, so our questions controller doesn't redirect to the show page, it redirects to the root path. It might make more sense to redirect to the question, I don't know. I kind of like the way it is now. But let's just demonstrate that we could change the code if what we actually wanted was it to redirect to the question show page. We could make that change to our code. So if we look right now at the questions controller, and we look at what happens when we create, it's really clear what we do right now, right? So if we don't want it to do that, then we could just redirect to the last question that was added, right? That's one way that we can redirect to the question show page. So if we change this to redirect to question last, then if we run it again, then that one passes. Okay, so this is just an example of the test is going to test a certain behavior, and if that's not the behavior that happens, then the test is going to fail. So then you have to decide, do I want to change the test or do I want to change behavior? If we wanted it to redirect to the root path, what would we have to do to get this test to pass?
Change it to root path instead of wherever it is now.
Yeah, so right now the test says, let's look at the test.
Would it be better to change the create, instead of redirect to last question, would it be better to just redirect to the actual question itself? Because if two people create it at the same time, then somebody's got to shut the internet.
Yep. Yep, we could do that. That is a good point. No, that would never happen. That would never happen. Yes, we could. We could do that.
I can test it.
Yeah, you don't need to use your mobile phone.
So just to close the loop on this, if we wanted it to redirect to root path, then we would just change this, wouldn't we?
Yeah, so root path.
Yep. That's right. Which I kind of like better, you know, that it redirects back to the home page and shows the question at the top, but
Unless somebody's like hovering over the root all the time, it's like, oh, there's an answer I can answer.
yes. But this is what you go to when you create a question, though, right? But I guess if you were like super eager to see if people answer it, then you'd want it to redirect to that page, and then you just keep refreshing it. I don't know. See if somebody answers it.
I wonder what Stack Overflow does.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll leave it for the moment just because I'm going to be aware of time. We're going to run out of time. Okay. Okay, let's look at the other failure. So we changed the behavior to redirect to the show question page. Alternatively, we could change the test to expect to redirect to the root path. So we looked at how we do that. In either case, our test will ensure that if we change our app's behavior, it's intentional. So that's the big thing, right? Is to make sure that when we make changes, they're intentional and it's communicated. Because if we would have a process that these tests are run before you're allowed to commit your code, or to push your code up to for a pull request to happen anyway, for a pull request to go through. You could build in continuous integration so these tests are run, the test would fail, and that would kind of force everybody to know what's going on. So the last post error is related to the invalid attributes context test, and it expects to display the new template when there is a failure. So we've passed parameters, and those are invalid parameters, and the expectation in this test is when it gets invalid parameters, it should redirect to the new page again so that you can put in the correct parameters, right? That's the expectation. And so right now what we're doing is we're not forcing that validation step. We just send it on. Whatever we get, we just pass on and we try to create, and that's not really what we want to do. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're validating and we stay on that page until we get something valid. So one way to accomplish that is to add these validation methods to our model. That's one way to do that. So we can add these validates statements. They don't have to be these exactly. These are just reasonable validations for an email and a body, that we have at least 5 characters in people name. We could check for other things, obviously, that there's an @ in there and other stuff like that.
You people just pass like a regex expression and then be okay?
I think so. I'd have to look up the syntax. And honestly, this test is a little bit bogus because the forms that we use are going to do that validation anyway.
Yeah.
It's not going to let us get to the point of actually sending the post if we don't have valid information in the fields. But it doesn't hurt to have this test in our model. And again, it's sort of enforcing this intentionality about what we want to say is valid information to create one of these objects, and if that changes, then forcing people to notice that that's changed. So if we go under app to models to the question, model, and we include those validations.
Janelle,
Yes.
you said the form will block invalid emails. Will the form block invalid emails that you postman in?
That you postman in.
Yeah. Like if you just manually send your own post.
The form won't, but
Yeah.
this would catch it though.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there, to follow on from that, is there some easy library of validations that just exactly match the form? Is there a way to just look at a form that you've made and get the correct validation from, or vice versa?
I don't know that there is a short answer to that, just because there's so many different kinds of forms. And like the default form helper with Rails, it's probably true that there is something. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but I would imagine with the forms helper that we're using by default in Rails would have something like that. Yeah, because if we try to, like, if you use the app,
For the regex stuff, there is validates email with format URI mail to email regex.
nice.
So it does it all for you.
But if you actually look at the app, and I just try to click submit here,
It does it all for you.
it does it for you anyway. Yeah. And see, so don't have to worry about it if it's running from your app. But yeah, you could protect yourself from stuff coming in a different way. But really, if nothing else, like I mentioned before, it just forces intentionality about what you're building, and that if things change, that everybody knows that they changed. So if I run the test again, did I save? That might just still be a problem. Yeah. But now we have a different problem. So it tells us cannot redirect to nil. So we see a different error. And the way that we can manage that is we could do some error handling in our controller. Right, so in case of just trying to redirect, then we can do some error handling and decide what we want to do when an invalid question comes through. So if you look at our create right now, it just does question.create and just assumes that everything's going to be okay. Just passes through what it gets and assumes it's all going to be okay. We could take advantage of the valid method if we create the question object first with new, and then we can check to see if it's valid, and then if it's valid we can save it. So a create just does a new and a save in one operation. So if we separate that out and do the new first and then check to see if it's valid and then call save and then redirect if we manage to validate it and save it. So if we do that, in our controller. So right now we just do a create. And I have all my ends. Oh, yeah, I forgot.
Line 18 as well.
Hmm. Okay. So all I'm doing there is adding in a validation step, which is a good thing to do, right? So this kind of testing will just kind of highlight for you places in your controller where you should be doing some validation instead of just passing on values. Because when you're testing kind of manually, in the forms forcing you to put in good information, then you never get into this use case. And you're like, well, this always works. I can just call question create. It's never going to be a problem. But it's always good to have some validation in your controller, because you want to make sure that if, for example, we wanted to use some of this code at some later time, using a different interface, that it would still work appropriately there. And again, back to the argument, if anything changes, we know that we're being intentional about it. And if it breaks the test, everybody will know. Okay, so that made all of the post tests pass. Cool. All right, so that's all that I was going to cover today, just in the interest of not overdoing it. It didn't take as long as I thought it would. That wasn't too bad. Did I go too fast? Did that all make sense? Was that all right? Do you feel confident that you could add some RSpec testing?
I feel confident I could copy and paste and then change the fields.
Yeah.
I'm further confident.
Yeah. So look, if you do that a couple of times though, because the commands aren't tricky, are they? It's just different. So you're not familiar with it yet, and you have to get used to syntax whenever you do something new. There's syntax to get used to. But it's what's actually happening isn't very complicated, So if we look back at the kinds of errors that we got, let's go back to some of the first ones. Sometimes just the error itself doesn't tell you enough. Sometimes it does. Like the pending statements, the tests are written in a way to show you exactly what needs to be added. Sometimes, like this, isn't super helpful. Like returns a success response failed. That's not super helpful. You actually have to go look at the test and see where is it doing a get to, and why am I not getting a 200 response from that? And then you'd have to go look at the controller and look at the index method and see, oh, well, in my index I'm redirecting to root path. I'm not going to the question index page. And then you'd see that that's the change that needs to be made. And that just takes some practice, I guess, and familiarity with the code. Let's have a look at this. So this Relish site, which I have linked in that slide, but also there's a link at the end about the expect things that you can check. But the controller specs, this one is particularly handy. So use this one when you're doing your Rails app to write some controller specs. So you can look for render template, redirect to, we saw that, have HTTP status, we saw that. There's some examples there that are pretty decent. And then there are specs for views and routes and things too, so you can have a look at those. And then there's this guide to testing is actually quite good too, which will talk more about using mini-test and fixtures and how that works. So if you're interested in using mini-test, then this is a really nice guide for it. And this one is the RSpec expectations. So there's the built-in matchers, which are the ones you'll see the most. There's 2B, 2 equal, 2 raise error, and you can put a not in front of any of these. So you can say to not be truthy, to not be equal, or to not equal. So have a look through those and just play with them a bit. Yeah, to be or not to be, to not be. So I think it's okay if for the moment you just use what's in these slides and copy and paste and work out when you get errors how you're going to fix those errors. Okay, I think that is a really good exercise. If you have a play with it and you get stuck, like you get errors and you have no idea how to fix them, then, ask me about it or ask Matt about it, and we can look at why failures are happening and how to fix those. But it's always a matter of looking at the error messages, like this one's fairly useful. Expect response to redirect to question.last. And then looking at the test and looking at the code that it's testing. Where's the code that it's testing? It's, if you're running the controller spec, then the code's in the controller for that object. So that's where you have to go look at the code. And then it just takes practice. So you have to practice it. If you've been doing the morning challenges, hopefully also you're taking some time to look at the tests that are there and understanding how those tests are written. There's a lot of similarities between the tests and the morning challenges and the test that we're using here. But that can help too. Any questions? No? You could try to add some stuff to like the stuff that you built with Matt Stubbs on Tuesday. The app that you built there, you could try to add some RSpec to it. See if you get some success. Have play with it. It's always really satisfying when you get all greens. Just saying. It's like small victories.